He said, I later came to regret it. And a lot of those people were bad people. Like, you know, how he talks about that. He said they were bad people. And he said, I don't want to do that this time. I want to do something completely different. And he said, we're going to launch a transition committee starting this week. So normally the transition committee is paid for by the GAO, by the General Accounting Office. And you don't launch till after the election. But with him, he got private donors to pay for the transition committee, and he's starting it 4 or 5 months early, so that they can actually put a government in place. And then another thing he said is, you know, one of the big complaints against President Trump has been that he's sort of a captive of the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. And he said to me, he said, you know, Project 2025, they keep trying to stick that to me. And I've never read it. I never heard it. I heard of it until people started telling me that I was behind it. And he said, that was written by a right-wing asshole. This is what he said to me. And he said, there are left-wing assholes and there are right-wing assholes. And that was written by a right-wing asshole. And so in that way, you know, he kind of, you know, disavowed this kind of ideological pigeonhole that they're trying to put him in. And I think his administration is going to be really interesting because, like you said, he's surrounded by people who are entrepreneurial, who really are common sense people who want to do the right thing for our country. And, you know, I also came to understand President Trump in a different light. And it's easy for me to understand because I've been vilified and demonized by the press and the view of me, you know, across the kind of the liberal landscapes is that, you know, I'm this really insane, crazy person. And you know, but a lot of people, I you know, take that for as gospel, as reality. And, you know, I think a lot of the things that have been said about President Trump are the same thing. They're things that are propaganda tropes. They're very simplistic characterizations of him that miss some of the richness of his character and of his personality.
Yeah, well, that seems to be especially the case now that he has this quite remarkable team around him. So let me steelman the Democrats for a second and tell me what you think of this. I have a number of Democrat contacts, and they've been making a case to me that things have genuinely shifted since Harris took the reins, and they point to such things as relatively less emphasis being placed, for example, at the DNC on the climate crisis and carbon dioxide, a relative shelving or siloing of the more radical leftist movement within the Democrats, which, in my experience, they've declined to even admit that exists, which has been a kind of blindness that to me is nothing short of miraculous. Is it possible that there is a shift towards the center in the Democrat Party? And have we seen that since Harris took the reins? And do you have any hope in that regard? Or was your experience, your personal experience with their machinations and the problems that you detailed out so comprehensive that you think that what was that? Is too little too late or not real at all, I guess?
Well, it's hard to look into somebody else's head. So I make a practice of not doing it. But what I would say is a couple of things. One is that both Tim Walz and Kamala, and I made this point before, and then Hillary yesterday, who's kind of the bellwether for, you know, who the Democratic Party is, all have been very, very vocal about censorship, about their enthusiasm for government censorship, and about how they're going to crack down on the social media. Nobody has spoken out about the censorship now taking place in Europe or in Brazil, where...
Do you see that as characteristic of Newsom's new bill, for example?
Yeah, the bill that they have here in California, but the ban on Twitter in Brazil, the arrest of Pablo Durov in France, which is, you know, an extraordinary event, that the head of Telegram would be pulled off his plane when he stopped for a refueling stop and put in jail. And there's no reason to do that because Europe is openly censoring content already. And by the way, they do have, you know, Pablo Durov Pavel Durov is a resident of Abu Dhabi, and France has a extradition treaty with Abu Dhabi, so they could arrest him anytime they wanted. And it seemed to be like a deliberate signal to the world about if you mess with the machine, you are going to be chewed up and spit out. And also, I think having to do with the Ukraine war, because Telegram is widely used in Ukraine and also Russia, and there are listservs or groups in Ukraine that are pro-Ukrainian and in Russia that are anti-Ukraine war, or pro-Russian in that war. And I think that it was probably U.S. instigated. France has as robust an attachment to freedom of speech as we have in our country. In 1789, during the French Revolution, they passed all of these bills that are still on the books that make freedom of speech sacred in France. And then in the 1880s, they passed another slew of bills that reinforced and fortified the tradition of freedom of speech. So it was as robust, their attachment of freedom of expression, as it is in this country. And yet they abandoned it, overnight. And if America really was the exemplary nation, if we were the promoter of democracy around the world, we would spend less time overthrowing democratically elected governments and more time defending freedom of speech as the Western democracy has abandoned it. We would be objecting, and we would be saying, this is bad for you, but it's also bad for Americans.
Right.
I mean, you had this, somebody I would consider an insane person, Thierry Breton, the commissioner of the European Commission.
He quit this week, eh?
Oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Who threatened